The night smelled like rain and bleach. The mop bucket sat near the porch steps, still half full from where Carl had cleaned the kitchen floor earlier. I remember the way the porch light flickered, casting his shadow long and crooked on the grass. 18 felt like a thin layer of armor too soft to stop anything sharp. That night, it was paper thin. It was October 29 in Columbus, Georgia, and I was hours away from leaving home to enlist at Fort Benning. My backpack was already by the door. I had imagined this night for years. I thought maybe my mother would hug me. Maybe she would say she was proud. Instead, I watched my stepfather raise the mop bucket with both hands like it was a trophy. He grinned in that way he always did when he wanted to humiliate someone, and said loud enough for the neighbors to hear that no one in their right mind believed I would last through basic. The people in the yard laughed before the water even hit me. It came down in one cold slap. Dirty water ran through my hair and down my neck. My t-shirt clung to my skin. I tasted bleach on my lips. Carl laughed like it was the best joke he had ever told. Ethan, his son, raised a red plastic cup to toast him. My mother stood on the porch with her arms crossed, her face frozen between shame and approval. She did not speak. She never did when he turned me into the punchline. Someone muttered that this was what happened to kids who thought they were soldiers. I stared straight ahead and did not wipe my face. In that silence, I learned something about myself. I had begged for love in that house for too long. That night, the begging stopped. Carl leaned in close, his breath reeking of whiskey, and said that the army chewed up girls like me and spat them out. I felt the water dripping off my chin. I remember every drop. I remember how cold it was and how warm the porch light looked in contrast. I did not cry. I did not run. I stood still until the laughter turned awkward. He expected me to break. I looked at him the way soldiers look at incoming fire. Not afraid, just calculating. If anyone had listened close, they would have heard something inside me shift. I walked inside without a word. My boots left wet prints on the floorboards. My mother followed me into the hallway, but she did not say a single thing. She never said anything when it mattered. I went into the bathroom, peeled off the soaked t-shirt, and looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was plastered to my forehead. My skin smelled like bleach. I thought of the uniform waiting for me at Fort Benning and how it would fit like armor, not paper. I thought of Carl laughing and how one day that laugh would break in his throat. Not because I screamed back, not because I swung my fists, but because I would outlast every single word he threw at me. The house behind me felt like a cell I had already escaped. The next morning I walked out the door at dawn without saying goodbye. No one stopped me. No one hugged me. But as the bus pulled away from the curb, I whispered to myself that I would build something bigger than their cruelty. One day, they would watch me on a screen and realize they were never part of my story. They were only the stain on the first page. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and time below and tell me if anyone ever underestimated you. I grew up in a small, single-story house just outside Columbus, Georgia, with paint peeling off the porch rails and a yard that always smelled like wet grass after summer storms. My father had died when I was 8. The day he was buried, the house became quieter in a way that did not feel like grief, more like something had been taken and never returned. 2 years later, my mother married Carl Watson. He moved in with his polished boots, his heavy belt, and his loud voice that made even the walls flinch. He never raised a hand to me when others were watching, but he never needed to. His words did the job. Army is for failures, he would say when I talked about enlisting one day. He would say it with that smirk that turned my stomach into stone. Ethan, his son from a previous marriage, became the golden boy overnight. My mother called him gifted. Carl called him the future. I became the shadow that washed the dishes and kept quiet. Ethan got birthday parties with fireworks. I got chores. When I came home with straight A's, Carl said, "Good for you." When Ethan got a B, Carl clapped like he had won a war. My mother changed after Carl moved in. Her laugh grew smaller. Her voice learned to choose silence. She wanted peace and thought silence would buy it. I wanted air and kept finding walls. My grandfather on my father's side was the only one who looked at me like I mattered. He had served in the army decades before and used to tell me stories about discipline and courage on long summer nights on his porch. He gave me my first dog tag when I was 12. He told me if I ever felt small to hold it in my fist and remember I could be more. When he passed away a year later, I kept that dog tag under my pillow. I dreamed of Fort Benning even then. Carl liked to test me. When I was 14, I started doing push-ups in the backyard, just me and the red dirt. I remember counting in whispers, my hands slipping slightly on the old concrete path, the sun cutting into my shoulders. Carl walked out with a beer in his hand and that half grin that always meant trouble. He said nothing at first. He walked to the faucet, filled a bucket, and poured it on the concrete where my hands were. The water spread, mixing with dust and making a slick mud. My palms slid and I fell face first into it. He laughed so hard he had to hold his stomach. My mother watched from the kitchen window. She turned away before I could look at her. That was when I learned she would never stand between us. She would always turn away. Ethan used to call me Private Mud whenever Carl pulled that stunt in front of him. He never missed a chance to remind me I was not really his sister, just the girl his dad had to deal with. He got everything. New clothes, tutors, praise. I got silence, judgment, and dirty water. At dinner, Carl sat at the head of the table and told stories about how real men built empires. My mother smiled like a good audience. Ethan soaked it up. I learned to keep my jaw locked tight. By the time I turned 16, I knew my mother's love had rules. She loved me when it was quiet. She loved me if I did not make Carl angry. She loved me if I made myself small. But she never loved me loud enough to make him stop. That kind of love is a cage. It does not break you in one night. It rusts you slowly. I spent long nights staring at the dog tag my grandfather had given me, imagining a world where my worth did not depend on Carl Watson's voice. I started running before sunrise, long routes down the highway, my sneakers tearing at the asphalt. I lifted weights in the garage. I practiced pull-ups on the doorframe. Every mile was a way to burn their laughter out of my bones. Ethan and Carl saw it as a joke. Carl said if I ever enlisted, the Army would send me home in a week. Ethan laughed and added maybe I would trip at the gate. My mother just said nothing. She always said nothing. The night before my high school graduation, Carl told me no soldier ever came out of this family and no soldier ever would. He said it with that calm cruelty he liked to use when he wanted it to stick. I went to my room and wrote down on a piece of paper the exact words he had used. I folded that note and tucked it behind my grandfather's dog tag. I promised myself I would keep it until the day I made him choke on his certainty. As I got older, the house did not feel like home anymore. It felt like a test I needed to pass. The kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner and regret. The living room walls were lined with Ethan's awards. There was not a single photo of me on display. Even my father's old medals were stored in a box in the attic, buried under Ethan's soccer trophies. By the time I turned 18, I did not expect love from them anymore. I only expected silence. But the silence taught me how to listen to myself. It taught me how to stand alone. I enlisted with no one cheering and no one stopping me. In their eyes, I was leaving like a runaway. In mine, I was finally walking out of their script. That is the thing about growing up in a house built on control. One day you realize they never planned to see you as anything but a footnote. That night, holding my enlistment papers in my hand, I understood something simple and cold. They would never be on my side. Not then, not ever. And that was fine. I did not need them. I only needed to outlast them. Fort Benning smelled like damp earth and iron. The first morning of basic training in 2010, I stood in formation with 40 strangers who looked just as terrified as I felt. The air was heavy with humidity mosquitoes and the sound of boots scraping against gravel. The drill sergeants moved like a storm across the field, voices cutting through the early light. I had never felt so small and so alive at the same time. By the end of the first week, the blisters on my heels had torn open and my throat burned from trying to keep up with cadence. No one cared where you came from, at least not officially, but the barracks had a way of making every difference visible. I did not talk about my family, but stories leak in places like that. Someone had overheard me on the phone telling a friend back home that my stepfather laughed when I enlisted. By the next morning, whispers followed me like a trail of smoke. A couple of recruits made jokes behind my back about being the girl whose family thought she would fail. One of them said people like me usually wash out by week 4. I learned to keep my jaw locked and my eyes forward. The days blurred together. Reveille before dawn PT until sweat burned my eyes, meals that tasted like metal trays and lukewarm eggs. We marched until our legs screamed, and then we marched some more. At night, the barracks went quiet except for the sound of boots hitting the floor for last-minute push-ups or whispered calls home. I sat on the edge of my bunk with my grandfather's dog tag pressed against my palm and reminded myself why I was there. It was not to prove them wrong. It was to prove myself right. The first real test came during a ruck march in week 3. It was still dark when we set out packs heavy enough to grind into shoulders. My knees ached by mile 7. 2 recruits behind me started complaining. One of them whispered my name with a sneer. I did not turn around. I focused on the gravel beneath my boots and the steady rhythm of breathing, one step after another. That is what kept me from quitting. When we finally reached the ridgeline, a few of the guys collapsed on the grass. I stayed standing. Sergeant Morales noticed. He was built like a wall, his voice rough but never wasted. He walked up to me, looked at my soaked uniform, and asked why I was still on my feet. I said because no one was going to carry me. He did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted. Week after week, he pushed us harder. In the gas chamber exercise, half the platoon panicked, clawing at their masks. I stood in the corner, tears streaming, lungs burning, counting down in my head until it was over. Morales saw me walk out last, coughing but steady. That night during chow, he passed by and tapped the edge of my tray with his knuckle. It was not praise, but it was something. The nights were the hardest. The showers were cold, the lights always too bright and the silence too loud. Sometimes I stood under the water until my skin went numb. Tears came quietly, but I never let anyone see them. I made a promise to myself the first night in the barracks. No matter what, I would not quit. Not here. Not where Carl expected me to fail. During one particularly brutal rainstorm in late spring, Morales organized a night field exercise. We were soaked before it even began. Mud clung to our boots, rifles felt heavier, and the wind cut through every layer. We crawled through the obstacle course under barbed wire while rain pounded against our helmets. A recruit next to me cursed and said he could not do it. I told him to keep moving. I do not know why I said it. Maybe because if I stopped talking, the fear would win. When we finally reached the last checkpoint, Morales barked at us to form up. Lightning flashed across the sky. He shouted that every soldier needed a call sign, something that told the world what they were made of. One by one, people shouted words. Some were trying to sound tough, others funny. When it came to me, the wind ripped through the field. I remembered Carl's laugh, the bleach smell, the mud, the nights I had stood alone. I said, "Iron Flame." Morales nodded once. From that night on, the name stuck. Iron Flame became more than a call sign. It became armor. Every time someone doubted me, I reminded myself of those 2 words. I whispered them when my hands shook on the firing line. I whispered them when my knees gave out during sprints. Morales started calling me by it during training. At first, it was just him, then the others followed. The same recruits who had whispered behind my back now called out Iron Flame when we formed ranks. Basic training did not get easier. I just got harder. The blisters healed into calluses. The whispers turned into silence. I learned to shoot straight, march steady, and speak less. Morales pulled me aside one evening after weapons cleaning and told me not everyone was built to endure. Some just survive long enough to find out they are stronger than they thought. He said I was one of them. That night, I sat on my bunk and felt something I had not felt in years. Not love, not pride. Something quieter and stronger. A sense of belonging to myself. By graduation day, the air was thick with humidity and hope. Families filled the bleachers waving flags. My mother did not come. Carl did not come. Ethan did not come. I stood on the parade ground alone. But I was not alone. Morales stood behind us, eyes sharp, jaw set. When my name was called, I walked forward, accepted the handshake, and felt the weight of the moment press into my spine. Iron Flame. That was mine now. And for the first time, I did not care who watched or who stayed away. I had survived the place that was supposed to break me. That was enough. The first time I set foot in Korengal Valley, the air felt different, thinner, and colder, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. It was early 2013, my first real deployment, and everything they had drilled into me at Fort Benning felt like it was about to be tested for real. Our unit had been briefed on the terrain, the choke points, the sound of gunfire bouncing off the ridges, but no amount of classroom maps could prepare you for the way the valley swallowed sound and made every echo feel like a threat. We moved through the narrow pass before dawn boots crunching on frost-crusted dirt. I was still young enough to think that missions followed the plan. That illusion lasted less than an hour. The first crack of gunfire came from somewhere high on the eastern ridge. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a trap snapping shut. I hit the ground before my brain caught up, my cheek pressed into the frozen mud, the weight of my gear dragging against the rocks. The squad leader yelled contact left and the valley erupted. Muzzle flashes flickered between the trees like angry stars. Bullets tore through the branches and the air screamed. 2 of our guys went down fast. Ramirez caught shrapnel near the shoulder and Wilson's leg twisted underneath him when he dove for cover. The medic was pinned behind a boulder too far back. I remember the sound of Wilson's breathing, harsh and wet, cutting through the gunfire. Everyone was shouting, but I tuned it out. Training took over. Not the yelling, not the fear, just the cold focus they had hammered into us. I crawled forward low, using the uneven terrain to mask my movement. My gloves ripped open on the rocks, but I barely felt it. I slid in next to Wilson, grabbed his vest strap, and pulled him toward a dip in the ground. Bullets smacked into the dirt inches away. Someone screamed for me to get back. I didn't listen. Ramirez was closer to the ridge, his blood pooling into the frost. I could see him trying to move, but his arm hung useless. I made the calculation in seconds. Stay here and both would bleed out. Move fast and maybe we had a chance. I shouted to Wilson to keep pressure on his leg and started crawling toward Ramirez. Every inch felt like a mile. I counted my breaths, used the rhythm to block out everything else. When I reached him, he was barely conscious. I looped my arm under his chest harness and dragged. He wasn't small. Every pull sent fire down my back, but quitting wasn't an option. I had no one waiting at home to care if I made it back, but I was not going to let someone die on my watch. Morales's voice from Fort Benning rang in my head. Nobody carries you. You carry yourself. I carried him too. Cover fire opened behind me as someone finally saw what I was doing. A burst of gunfire chewed into the rocks above us. Dirt rained down like ash. When I finally got Ramirez behind the boulder, the medic grabbed him without a word. I turned around and crawled back for Wilson. He tried to joke that I was crazy. I told him to shut up and hold on. We made it to the fallback line as the squad pushed out, suppressing fire. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the cold and the weight of adrenaline. When the firefight ended hours later, the valley was quiet again, the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. We secured the ridge, medevac came in, and the 2 guys I had dragged out were still breathing. That was the only thing that mattered to me. Back at the outpost, the platoon was silent, at first, the kind of silence that hangs heavy when everyone has seen what could have gone another way. The squad leader approached, held out a small coin between his fingers. Coin of excellence. He didn't give speeches. He just pressed it into my palm, nodded once, and walked away. The metal was cold, heavier than it looked. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't a parade. But it was the first time someone outside of myself acknowledged that I had done something that mattered. I slept that night on a cot in a drafty tent with the coin tucked under my pillow next to my grandfather's dog tag. I stared at the ceiling and thought of Columbus, Georgia, the porch light, the bucket of mop water, Carl's laugh. I imagined him hearing about what had happened here, about how the girl he said would not last a week had dragged 2 soldiers out of a kill zone. But no one called, no one wrote. No one back home asked if I was alive. My family never cared about what I did in the uniform. They only cared when they could use it as a joke. So I stopped expecting anything from them. The next morning, the captain pulled me aside during formation. He said he had seen soldiers freeze under less fire than what I faced yesterday. He told me not to get cocky, but to remember what I had done. I nodded, said yes, sir, and went back to my line. It wasn't about pride. It was about proving something to myself. That I belonged here. That iron flame wasn't just a call sign I chose to sound strong. It was real. It was who I was becoming. Weeks passed and the mission reports went up the chain. Somewhere in a file in a dusty office, my name got attached to a commendation line. But at home in that small house in Georgia, nothing changed. No message, no pride, not even a sarcastic remark. It should have hurt, but it didn't. It just made the wall between us harder cleaner. I understood then that I wasn't fighting for their recognition. I was building something they would never be part of. That realization was colder than Korengal Valley, but it was honest. And honesty, unlike love in that house, would never turn away. By 2015, I had already learned the most valuable lesson of my career. Power grew quietly. It didn't need applause. It needed precision, discipline, and the kind of silence that made people underestimate you until it was too late. I never bragged after Korengal. I didn't collect stories for bar nights. I collected skill sets like weapons, one after another. By the time my peers were posting about promotions, I was already mapping my next move. I was 24, leaner, quieter, and sharper than I had ever been. The coin of excellence was still tucked inside my locker, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. I never displayed it. I didn't need a reminder. The fire was already carved into bone. I spent the next years moving through ranks at a steady, deliberate pace. Team leader, squad leader, platoon sergeant. Each title felt less like glory and more like a rung on a ladder I was building one steel bar at a time. I was often the youngest in the room and sometimes the only woman. That didn't bother me. If anything, it kept me focused. I learned to speak less, listen more, and act surgically. When they underestimated me, I let them. It gave me an edge. By the time they realized what I was capable of, I had already closed the gap. During a training rotation in Louisiana in 2016, my unit simulated a breach under extreme weather conditions. High humidity lightning, uneven terrain, and equipment failure. Half the team froze under pressure. I pushed through the mud, took point, recalibrated the comms on the fly, and reoriented our flank before the instructors could even shout. It wasn't a heroic moment. It was execution. Cold, clean execution. After that, whispers about Iron Flame began moving beyond my platoon. I didn't chase special units. They came to me. By 2017, I was attached to a small tactical response team that specialized in electronic warfare defense. The work was quiet, buried beneath layers of classified operations, the kind of assignments that never made the news. We were the shadow behind the front line, the firewall no one talked about but everyone relied on. I liked it that way. Recognition was noise. Rank was strategy. At night, when most soldiers crashed on their bunks, I stayed up with a cup of black coffee, running simulations on my laptop, learning everything I could about electronic countermeasures. If I was going to build a fortress around myself, it wouldn't be with sentiment. It would be with skill no one could take away. My team began to trust my judgment in the field, not because I was loud, but because I was precise. A radio jam, a signal breach, a drone interference. If Iron Flame said move, they moved. In 2018, I was selected to attend Command and General Staff College in Kansas. For many, it was a stepping stone. For me, it was a quiet battlefield. The classrooms were filled with officers who had grown up in the military, sons and daughters of career families. I was the outlier, the girl from Columbus, Georgia, with no legacy to lean on. They dropped names. I dropped results. Every time someone tried to box me in, I slid past the edges. The academic load was brutal, the simulations worse. I thrived in both. I spent late nights in the wargaming lab pulling apart operational models and rebuilding them from scratch. One of my instructors, Colonel Jameson, stopped me after a particularly difficult exercise. He said most officers learned to follow doctrine, but I treated doctrine like clay. I molded it, reshaped it, used it as a weapon. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The battlefield rewards clarity, not compliments. By the time I graduated, my name was on a list few people ever saw. A short list for candidates likely to receive early strategic assignments. It wasn't a public honor. It was a door cracked open. I didn't celebrate. I tightened my laces and walked through it. The next 2 years were a blur of deployments operations and long nights in rooms without windows, places where the maps were classified and the missions didn't have headlines. In those rooms, Iron Flame became more than a call sign. It was a signal. My team knew when I spoke it wasn't to fill air. It was to act. I built that reputation inch by inch. No shortcuts, no applause. We ran silent operations across multiple regions, tracking enemy signal patterns, intercepting drone feeds, building counter-offensive protocols. My unit moved like smoke. No one outside the need-to-know chain even knew our names. That was exactly how I liked it. When you operate in the shadows, you don't owe anyone a performance. In 2019, during a joint operation with a special operations group, a critical signal breach almost cost us an entire forward team. While others scrambled, I rerouted our backup frequency and jammed the interference manually. It bought the team 15 seconds. 15 seconds was the difference between body bags and boots walking out. The commander didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He just sent an encrypted message later that night. Iron Flame. Solid work. I printed that message and folded it into the cloth with the coin. I stopped calling home years before. Carl's voice was always the same sharp, dismissive, uninterested. My mother would ask how I was, but never really listen. They didn't understand what I was doing. They didn't care. By then, the silence from them didn't hurt anymore. It just existed. A flat line where a heartbeat should have been. The promotions came slowly, then faster. Each one a quiet acknowledgement. First lieutenant, captain, then major. People around me celebrated, threw parties, took pictures. I shook hands, nodded, and went back to work. Someone asked me once why I never seemed excited. I told them excitement doesn't hold ground. Rank does. In 2020, at the end of a joint training with Allied forces, an older colonel from the British contingent asked me why I never asked for credit. He said people who stay quiet are either afraid or dangerous. I told him I wasn't afraid. He laughed and said he knew. That conversation stuck with me because he was right. I wasn't afraid. I was building something sharper than fear. Inside, I carried one simple thought like a blade. I never needed their applause. I needed the rank. The rank meant leverage. The rank meant I would never again be the girl standing on a porch soaked in dirty water while people laughed. That same year, a younger officer in my unit asked me about my call sign. He said Iron Flame sounded like something out of a story. I told him it was. A story that began with humiliation and turned into strategy. He didn't ask more. In the field, we didn't need explanations. We needed results. By the end of 2020, Iron Flame wasn't just my call sign. It was my reputation. It traveled faster than my file. Commanders who had never met me knew my name before I entered a room. They didn't always like me, but they respected me. Respect built in silence is harder to break than respect earned through noise. Sometimes late at night alone in my quarters, I thought about the girl at 18 drenched in mop water. I didn't feel pity for her. I felt precision. Every slight had been a brick, every bruise a foundation. They gave me nothing, so I learned to forge everything. The base in Kansas was colder in winter than Georgia ever was. I remember stepping out one night, frost clinging to the railings, the stars sharp above the parade ground. I whispered Iron Flame into the empty air. Not as a rallying cry, as a reminder. Everything I had built was real. Everything I had become was mine. When I walked through command halls in full uniform, I no longer felt like the outlier. I felt like the blade they hadn't seen being sharpened. One day they would, but not yet. Silence still had work to do. By 2021, everything I had built in silence began to move like an unseen current beneath the surface. The quiet work, the nights buried in code and comms rooms, the field deployments no one wrote about at all, converged into something bigger. They called it Operation Silent Veil, and I was placed in charge of tactical coordination before most even knew there was a threat. The Pentagon classified the situation under urgent cyber defensive measures. The attack came fast, a layered digital assault aimed directly at a critical communications backbone that linked several forward bases with the strategic command grid. If the breach succeeded, it wouldn't just expose operational details. It would blind entire units in active theaters. A silent battlefield is a dead battlefield. I remember the day we got the first ping. It was just after 200. My team was operating out of a fortified cyber defense cell in Virginia. The air was stale, the lights a dim blue meant to keep us awake without burning out our eyes. I had my boots on the floor headset pressed to my ear when the console lit up with cascading red flags. We traced the intrusion path in real time, bouncing from Eastern Europe through dummy nodes in Asia, wrapping back into decoy servers in the States. It was fast, clean, and coordinated. Whoever was behind it knew what they were doing. I didn't need to be told twice. I moved. I issued directives like a scalpel, not a hammer. Redirect node alpha. Reinforce gate 3. Split the traffic funnel. While others shouted updates, I spoke only when I needed to. My fingers moved over the keyboard like a weapon I'd trained with for years. Sweat pooled at the back of my neck. One wrong command and the enemy would ghost past us and we wouldn't even know what they took. At 0246, they launched their secondary strike, a mirror attack on a satellite uplink. I anticipated it 15 seconds before the alert hit. 15 seconds was everything. We locked it down. At 0312, I rerouted our entire communication through a secured fallback loop no one outside our team even knew existed. They slammed into the wall we built and their code shattered like glass. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was precision. Clean, silent precision. When the breach failed, our comms channels lit up with acknowledgments from bases across the network. We had just stopped an operation that could have crippled field units and potentially cost lives. I didn't celebrate. I just sat back, breathing hard eyes on the last line of code still blinking on my screen. At 0600 command walked in. They didn't waste words. They told me to pack my Class A uniform. A Black Hawk lifted me and 2 senior officers out by midday. By evening, I was standing in a secured briefing room inside the Pentagon. The walls were a dull cream, the lighting surgical. Generals sat at the far end of the long table. I stood at attention, hands, steady boots perfectly aligned. One of them asked for a verbal run-through of Silent Veil. I gave it to them without theatrics. Clear, sharp. When I finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then the senior officer nodded once and said, "That was well executed, Major Lockhart." They pinned the commendation directly in that room, without ceremony, without press. But later, someone leaked the story to the media. By morning, CNN ran a segment with my name and rank. A still frame from my Pentagon briefing filled the screen, my uniform crisp, the commendation glinting under the camera lights. I hadn't thought about Carl or Ethan in years, not in any way that mattered. But they saw me that day. For the first time, they saw me not as the girl on the porch or the embarrassment of the family, but as something they couldn't laugh off. I didn't call them, but my phone rang 2 days later. My mother's voice was small, almost cautious, like she wasn't sure who she was talking to anymore. She said, "Your stepfather saw the news." He didn't know what to say. For a moment, the weight of that house in Georgia pressed against my chest again, like the damp walls and lemon cleaner smell had followed me through time. But then it passed. I answered, "Good. He doesn't have to." And that was the end of it. I didn't ask about him. I didn't ask about Ethan. I didn't give them the chance to claim something they had no part in building. That night, as the city lights of Washington, D.C. flickered through the hotel window, I looked at the commendation they'd handed me at the Pentagon. It was clean and elegant, stamped with power. But that wasn't the part that mattered. What mattered was the way the room had fallen silent when I finished my briefing. The way seasoned generals, men and women who had seen everything had nodded once in quiet respect. I had spent years building without applause. And now that silence was paying dividends. Over the following weeks, my name started circulating in circles I had never bothered to imagine. High clearance meetings, special projects, joint task force rosters. Some people treated me like I had suddenly appeared overnight. They didn't understand that I had been sharpening this blade for over a decade. I didn't need them to understand. I only needed to keep moving forward. Command assigned me to advise on several classified cyber resilience initiatives. My calendar filled with briefings at the Pentagon, strategy calls, and black site visits where the windows never opened and the clocks never seemed to move. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't give interviews. I didn't post anything online. I didn't feed the narrative. Silence was still my strongest weapon. Somewhere back in Georgia, Carl Watson was sitting in his living room watching the news. I imagined his face the way it must have twitched when the anchor said my rank. I pictured Ethan scrolling through his phone, looking at the same image, realizing that the sister he mocked had outpaced every expectation he ever put on me. I didn't need their congratulations. Their silence was the only acknowledgement I wanted. Pentagon culture was ruthless. You didn't get far without sharp edges. But for me, this wasn't about climbing a ladder for the sake of climbing. It was about leverage. I walked those marble hallways like someone who knew exactly how much power she had earned. Every briefing I delivered, every question I answered, every strategy I laid out, they all pushed me closer to the future I had built brick by brick in the shadows. Late one evening, I found myself alone in a secure operations room, just the soft hum of machines and the muted glow of monitors. I held the same dog tag I had carried since I was 12. I thought of my grandfather. I thought of the girl on the porch. I thought of Carl's laugh echoing through the house. Then I slipped the dog tag back under my collar. This wasn't about them anymore. It hadn't been for years. People like Carl only believe in power when it slaps them across the face in public. CNN did that for me, but I didn't need that spotlight. I had already won the moment I walked into the Pentagon and delivered Silent Veil like a blade to the table. The rest was just noise. When my team returned to base, they threw a small gathering. Nothing official, just coffee-stale pastries and a quiet acknowledgement that we'd done something big. One of the younger analysts, barely 22, asked me if it felt good to see my name on the news. I looked at her and said I didn't do it for the news. She waited for me to say more, but I didn't. She nodded. She understood. Months later, my name was permanently attached to Silent Veil. It became part of my file, the kind of entry that opened doors no one could close again. That was the real victory. Not Carl's silence, not CNN, the record. The rank, the power. I had carved this path with no help, no family, no applause. Just iron flame, steady and silent. I never looked back at Georgia again. But I knew they were watching, and that was enough. By 2023, I had stopped expecting the past to come knocking. My life had settled into a rhythm that was sharp-structured and mine alone. The Pentagon briefings were a second language, the weight of command an extension of my own spine. I'd spent over a decade in uniform fighting battles, both seen and unseen, carving my name through grit, calculation, and silence. So when the promotion board moved to nominate me for Brigadier General, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like a target I had been quietly sighting for years, finally locking into place. What I didn't expect was that the past would show up wearing its Sunday best, pretending it belonged in my story. The first call came on a gray morning in early March. The air outside my D.C. apartment was cold, the city still shaking off winter. My assistant patched the call through, saying there was a Mr. Watson on the line. For a moment, I didn't even place the name. Then it clicked, like a distant door I'd nailed shut years ago. Carl. I almost laughed. I didn't answer. Hours later, a message from an unfamiliar number appeared on my personal phone. We just want to talk. It's important. Ethan. I stared at the screen for a long time, the edges of that name pulling old scars to the surface. I didn't reply. They didn't stop there. A week later, a letter arrived. Not an email. A letter. Thick envelope. Gold edges like they were sending something grand. Inside was a single handwritten note in Carl's heavy block letters. We're proud of you. We'd like to be there when you make history. This is our legacy too. My hand tightened around the paper until it creased. I didn't throw it away immediately. I just stood there holding it, and in that silence, the image of that porch all those years ago slammed back into me. 18, a bucket of mop water, their laughter cutting through me like a blade. And now, suddenly, it was our legacy. I didn't reply. But silence doesn't scare men like Carl. It provokes them. Within days, local reporters from Georgia began reaching out to Pentagon Communications, asking about the inspiring family story behind Major General nominee Ember Lockhart. My media officer flagged the inquiries with confusion. I didn't need to ask where they came from. Carl and Ethan had found their way to the press like rats through a vent. They were trying to graft themselves onto something they had never built. 2 weeks later, they showed up in person. It was a Friday afternoon. I was leaving a strategy briefing when I saw them waiting outside the security perimeter. Carl wore a suit, the kind that tried too hard to look expensive. His hair had thinned, his frame softened with age, but the way he stood chin up, jaw clenched, was the same as the man who had poured that filthy water on my head years ago. Ethan stood next to him in a navy blazer, hands in his pockets, wearing the smirk he used to wear when he mocked me. They looked like a photo op, not a family. Ember, Carl said, as I approached, his voice too casual, too warm for a man who hadn't spoken to me in over a decade. Ethan stepped forward before I could speak. "We're Family M. This is our legacy, too." For a second, I didn't hear their words. I heard the slosh of water. I saw 18-year-old me standing soaked on the porch, surrounded by their laughter. The world blurred at the edges for a heartbeat. Then it snapped back into sharp, cold focus. I said nothing. Silence is a weapon I've learned to wield better than any firearm. I walked past them. They followed. "This is a big deal," Carl insisted. "Your story, it's inspirational. The whole town wants to celebrate it." "We should be there. People will expect it. People." He meant himself. He always did. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and turned to look at them. Carl tried to hold my gaze the way he used to when I was a teenager, expecting me to shrink under it. I didn't. "You think I owe you a legacy?" I said quietly. He opened his mouth, but I kept talking. "You don't get to show up now. Not after everything." Ethan lifted his hands like a peace offering. "We've all made mistakes," he said. "But this is history. We can move forward. We're proud of you." I laughed then, a sound that startled even me. "Proud," I repeated. "You laughed when I enlisted. You called me a failure. You made sure everyone in that house knew I wasn't wanted." I took a step closer, my voice steady. "You don't get to rewrite the story just because it turned out well for me." Carl's face hardened. There it was, the real man beneath the polished suit. "We're not asking for much," he said. "Just acknowledgement. A seat. A name. After all, we're family." "No," I said. "Just that. No explanation. No negotiation." And I walked away. I thought that would be the end of it, but Carl Watson was never good at accepting other people's boundaries. Within days, I started hearing from contacts back in Georgia that he and Ethan were talking to local press, spinning a narrative of the proud family behind General Ember Lockhart. They posed for photos in front of that old house, like they had raised me on patriotism and honor. They lobbied an old city council friend to push a story about their contribution to my journey. They didn't need my permission to lie. They only needed a camera. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't have to. But the anger settled somewhere deep inside me. Not hot, not wild, just cold, controlled. I had spent my entire life turning their cruelty into steel. This was no different. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office flagged the local coverage. One of the officers asked if I wanted them to issue a statement correcting the narrative. I told them no, not yet. People like Carl always overplay their hand. I knew that better than anyone. A month before the promotion ceremony, Ethan sent me another message. This time, it was an image, a mock-up of a magazine cover from a local Georgia publication. Carl in a flag pin, Ethan in a military-style blazer standing proudly under the headline, "Hometown Family Behind a Hero." I stared at it for a long moment, feeling nothing but the familiar clarity I always felt before a mission. This wasn't personal anymore. It was tactical. They thought I was still that girl who wanted their acknowledgement, but the truth was, I didn't want their silence broken. I wanted it permanent. I called my aide and scheduled a private media briefing. No public statement, just preparation. I wasn't going to shout them down. I was going to make their entire narrative collapse on live television with the weight of their own history. Carl Watson had spent years making sure I felt invisible. Now the only thing he was going to see was how small he looked standing in my shadow. When I hung up the phone, I walked over to the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl on the porch. She wasn't even the soldier in Korengal Valley. She was Iron Flame. Cold. focused, unshakable. They had no idea what they were walking into, and that was their mistake. The morning of the hearing felt colder than the forecast predicted. Washington, D.C. was painted in early spring light, soft and pale, but the weight in the air around the Pentagon felt like steel. It was the kind of day when history decided whether it would whisper your name or carve it into stone. The formal hearing on Operation Iron Flame had drawn press from across the country. Officially, it was meant to be a high-level strategic briefing to the Senate Armed Services Committee, a rare window into a classified cyber defense success that had reshaped military infrastructure. Unofficially, it had become a stage. Reporters lined the barricades, flashes already cutting through the morning light. Flags flapped against the gray sky. Security checkpoints clicked open and closed in a rhythm as familiar to me as a heartbeat. I adjusted my uniform jacket, each metal aligned with surgical precision. My boots clicked softly against the marble floors. Every step forward was built on 15 years of silence, grit, and steel. Carl and Ethan were already outside. I saw them as I crossed the secured courtyard, dressed sharply, Carl with a flag pin on his lapel, Ethan standing half a step behind like a loyal shadow. Cameras surrounded them. They smiled and waved like they belonged here, like they had been part of the fight, like they hadn't poured mop water on the girl they now claimed as family. A banner scrolled across CNN's live feed at the bottom of the screen, Hometown Hero Family Supports General Nominee. I watched from the glass doors, hands steady at my sides. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of their voices bleeding through microphones. Carl was talking about how proud he was of me, how our family always believed I'd make something of myself. Reporters nodded, writing it down. None of them knew. Not yet. Inside the secure briefing room, everything was clinical and quiet. The senators sat at their long mahogany table, press representatives in the back rows. Cameras rolled. I took my seat at the witness table, the weight of my uniform grounding me like an anchor. Operation Iron Flame was on the agenda, but the moment belonged to something much older. When the chair recognized me to begin my opening statement, I didn't look at Carl. I didn't need to. I could feel his presence behind the cameras like a shadow I'd carried my entire life. I began with facts. Clear, disciplined, precise. I walked the room through the attack chain of 2021, how the breach was intercepted, how my team rerouted the communications architecture to preserve operational integrity. My voice never trembled. I'd fought battles with far less mercy than this room would give. The senators nodded. Questions came technical, strategic, controlled. I answered each with calm precision. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One of the committee members asked about the legacy of service in my family. I could almost hear Carl inhaling behind the press line. I could picture Ethan straightening his shoulders. It was a question they had not written, but it was one they were counting on. I let the silence stretch for a breath too long. Then I said, "There is a narrative out there that does not belong to me, a story being told by people who were never part of the fight. So I'd like to answer that question directly." I turned to the screen behind me and gave the signal to the technician. The lights dimmed slightly. A video clip appeared, grainy but clear. The porch. The evening light in Georgia. 18-year-old me standing straight hair, tied back enlistment papers in my hand. Carl stepping out of the house with a bucket, his laugh echoing through the recording, the filthy water pouring over my head, his words clear as day. "You'll never make it past basic girl." Laughter followed. A neighbor had recorded it years ago, disturbed by the cruelty of the scene, and quietly kept it. I found it last year when I cleaned the house out after my mother finally moved away. I had held on to it not for revenge, for truth. The room went silent. The senators stared at the screen. The press lowered their pens. The sound of Carl's laugh filled every corner of that room. When the clip ended, the silence stretched like a blade. I turned back to the microphone. My voice was steady, cold. Legacy isn't something you steal when it's convenient. It's something you bleed for. The cameras caught everything. Carl's face went pale first, his jaw tightening in the exact way it did the day he dumped that water. Ethan looked down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Their carefully crafted image cracked in front of millions. I didn't look away. I wanted them to feel every second of it. A reporter broke the silence from the press pool. General nominee Lockhart, she said carefully, was that your stepfather? Yes, I answered. No elaboration, no apology. Just the truth. Another reporter asked if I had anything to say to him now that I had the world's attention. I let a long breath fill the room before answering. I already said it when I was 18, I said. I just didn't have a microphone then. The chair cleared his throat, trying to move the hearing back to its original subject, but it didn't matter. The narrative had already shifted. The truth had been laid out in black and white, unvarnished and inescapable. Every camera in the room turned from the senators to the press gallery where Carl and Ethan sat, their faces frozen in a tableau of humiliation they had once tried to script for me. CNN's ticker changed almost instantly. General nominee exposes family humiliation on live TV. I looked at the senators, at the press, at the cameras. The only legacy I carry, I said, is the one I built with my own hands. No one else owns it. No one else gets to claim it. The chair nodded. No one argued. No one could. Outside, after the hearing adjourned, the courtyard was flooded with reporters. Carl and Ethan tried to leave quickly, but the questions followed them like heat. Why did you lie? Were you involved in her career at all? Carl pushed through the crowd, face flushed sweat beading at his hairline. He had spent a lifetime trying to control the narrative in rooms too small to matter. This time the stage was too big and the truth too loud. I walked out last. Cameras turned toward me like a wave. I didn't stop for interviews. I didn't need to explain. Everything that needed to be said was already on tape. As I stepped into the waiting car, the air outside was sharp and cool against my face. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like clarity, like every brick they'd thrown at me had finally been used to build a wall they could never climb. My phone buzzed later that evening. Messages from fellow officers, friends from the field, old commanders, who knew bits and pieces of the story but never the whole truth. Most just said one word: respect. Carl didn't call me that night, neither did Ethan. But the news didn't stop. The footage replayed on every major outlet, the sound of his laugh playing on a loop that he couldn't erase. The man who tried to humiliate me had ended up providing the evidence that built the clearest picture of who he really was. I sat alone in my apartment that night, the city lights glowing beyond the window. For the first time in years, the memory of that porch didn't make my hands shake. It made them steady. What would you have done if someone humiliated you like that at 18? Tell me below. The apology came 3 nights after the hearing, in the quietest hour of the evening, long after the press frenzy had turned from breaking news into an unshakable headline. My phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. For a moment I just stared at it, letting it ring until the sound cut out and silence filled the room again. But then it rang again. I picked up not out of hope, but to face the inevitable. Carl's voice came through low, unsteady, almost foreign. "Ember!" "It's me," he said. For years, his voice had been the sound of command, of mockery, of someone who thought power belonged to him. Now it was just small. He cleared his throat. "I saw the hearing. I saw everything." He paused, like the weight of his own shame had caught up with him. "I need to say something. I was drunk that night. I wasn't thinking straight. I never thought it would matter. You never thought I'd matter," I said quietly, cutting through his words like a blade. Silence spread thick between us. I could hear the sound of him breathing unevenly. He wasn't used to talking to me without control in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The word didn't land like a gift. It landed like a loose thread after a fire. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say I forgive you. I said nothing at all. After a long pause, I ended the call. The next morning, an email arrived from Ethan. No greeting, just a line that said, "We'd like to be part of the ceremony. It's a big day. It's family." He signed it with a flourish, like this was an invitation to a dinner party, not the aftermath of a lifetime of cruelty. I closed the email without replying, but they didn't stop. Ethan called my aide's office. Carl left another message this time, sounding almost frantic, begging to talk in person. And against every instinct, I agreed, not because they deserved it, but because I did. This story started on that porch in Georgia. It deserved to end there, too. 2 weeks before the promotion ceremony, I flew back to Columbus for the first time in over a decade. The town felt smaller, the air thicker, the streets both familiar and foreign. The house was still there, the same chipped porch rails, the same cracked driveway. It looked like a place time had passed but never fixed. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked to the backyard, the same backyard where Carl once poured mop water on my head and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever done. Carl was waiting there. His hair was thinner, his shoulders slouched, his hands shaking slightly. My mother sat on the porch steps, quiet older, her face lined not with strength but with years of silence. Ethan stood near the fence, wearing that old polished smile, like he still thought he could charm his way into anything. Carl spoke first. Ember, I raised a hand, stopping him. Don't start with excuses. He swallowed. I'm sorry, he said again, louder this time. I was drunk. I was angry. I thought it was a joke. I didn't think you'd carry it forever. You didn't think I'd survive it, I corrected. His eyes fell to the ground. Ethan stepped forward. Look, I know things were bad, but this is bigger than the past now. This is history. We're Family M. We just want to be there with you, to stand with you on stage when they pin that star. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how perfectly predictable it was. They still believed everything revolved around them, that my moment, my rank, my years of service, my blood and bone was something they could show up for like a parade. I reached into the case I'd brought with me and set my uniform jacket on the table between us. The rank insignia gleamed in the fading afternoon light, the metals catching soft reflections from the house behind me. Their eyes followed it like moths to flame. I built this alone, I said slowly, my voice steady as steel. Every step, every rank, every scar. You didn't stand with me then. You don't get to stand with me now. Carl's lip trembled. I'd never seen him cry before, not even when my father died. But now in the backyard where he once broke me, his eyes filled and his shoulders folded in on themselves. My mother didn't move. She didn't cry. She just sat there, hands clasped, like she finally understood the cost of all the years she looked away. Ethan tried again, his voice a notch softer. People will notice if we're not there. I turned to him. Good, I said. They should. That night, I drove away from the house without looking back. The porch light flickered behind me just like it did the night I left at 18. But this time, I wasn't running from them. They were the ones left standing in the dark. When the press coverage hit the following week, the consequences came like a hammer. Investigative journalists dug into their sudden family legacy claims. Old neighbors came forward. The recording from that porch went viral across every major outlet. Carl's interviews vanished overnight. Ethan's political ambitions imploded. He had been negotiating a local council contract that collapsed the moment the truth surfaced. Nobody wanted their name attached to a man who laughed at a teenage girl trying to serve her country. Carl became a symbol not of pride, but of what happens when cruelty meets the wrong kind of spotlight. He couldn't walk into town without whispers trailing behind him. My mother stopped answering reporters. Ethan deactivated every social media account he owned. I didn't celebrate their downfall. It wasn't revenge. It was gravity. The truth had simply found its way home. A few days before the ceremony, Carl called one last time. I let it ring out. He left a message. His voice was quiet, stripped of ego. I'm proud of you, he said. Even if you hate me, I'm proud. I deleted it without listening to the rest. I didn't hate him. Hatred gives someone a place inside you. He didn't have that anymore. On the morning of the ceremony, as the uniform went on, every fold pressed and every ribbon set, I thought of that backyard, of the man who once laughed and the woman who turned away. I thought of the girl who stood alone at 18, drenched and humiliated. And I thought of the woman I had become, untouchable, unborrowed, unclaimed. While Carl hid from reporters, I walked into the Pentagon courtyard to the sound of cameras flashing and brass saluting. They would watch from a television like the strangers they had made themselves. And that was exactly how it should be. When I walked out of the Pentagon for the last time in uniform, the sun was setting behind the city, throwing a warm copper light across the stone walls. The weight of the stars on my shoulders felt different that day. Lighter, not because it mattered less, but because I had finally decided it was time to build something that belonged entirely to me. Not the army, not the Pentagon, not the endless cycles of strategy rooms and classified corridors. Me. I had served 15 years. I had climbed every rung they told me I couldn't. I had bled for a flag they said wasn't mine. And now I was leaving on my own terms, not because I was tired, but because I finally understood what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. Not medals, not headlines, people. I bought the land 2 months after I signed my retirement papers. It was in Missouri, away from the noise of D.C., nestled between quiet rolling hills and stretches of green that seemed endless in the early morning fog. Old farmland, a good foundation. The first time I stepped on it, boots sinking slightly into damp earth, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the fragile kind you have to protect, the solid kind you build. I named it Iron Flame Institute, a place where veterans who felt forgotten could rediscover their fire, and where young recruits could learn leadership without cruelty, without the arrogance that I had grown up fighting against. It wasn't about polishing officers for the spotlight. It was about sharpening their spine for the storm. We started small, a handful of classrooms in converted barns, a training ground cleared by volunteers. But word traveled fast. Soldiers talk. Veterans talk even faster. And they came not for glory, but for something real. The first class arrived in the fall, 34 men and women all carrying different kinds of scars. Some from war, some from silence. They ran drills on the field, learned operational leadership, studied the history of conflict, not from the pages of textbooks, but from those who had lived it. I walked the grounds every morning before dawn, the mist clinging to my boots, watching them push themselves the way I once did alone. But here, they didn't have to be alone. That was the point. I didn't build statues or hang pictures of myself. I built a flagpole. A single American flag flew over the Institute, nothing else. Because this wasn't about me. It was about every person who had ever been underestimated, humiliated, broken down, and still stood up anyway. The press tried to turn the Institute into a redemption story. They wanted to write about the girl from Georgia who became a general and then built a school for the forgotten. But I refused most interviews. The story didn't belong to them either. It belonged to the people walking that training ground every morning. One evening, near the end of the first training cycle, I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside my office. When I opened the door, my mother was standing there. Older, now thinner, her shoulders curved slightly forward, like years of silence had finally started to weigh her down. She didn't call ahead. She didn't bring Carl. She just came. For a moment, we just stood there, the night wind pulling at the edges of her coat. She looked around the compound slowly, her eyes lingering on the flag, on the lights still burning in the classrooms. She stepped closer. "It's beautiful," she whispered. I didn't say anything. She looked at me the way someone looks at something they can't undo. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words hanging in the cool air between us. She didn't add excuses. No talk of Carl. No talk of the past. Just the words she should have said a lifetime ago. I didn't hug her. I didn't push her away either. I just nodded once and stepped aside so she could walk the grounds. We moved together in silence, her boots crunching next to mine on the gravel path, passing recruits still sitting around the fire pit after evening training. They saluted me as I walked by. She watched their faces, strong, tired, alive. Maybe for the first time, she saw the world I had built for myself, the world she never stood up to protect when I needed her most. We ended up at the edge of the courtyard beneath the flagpole. The flag flapped softly in the breeze, catching the light from the lanterns lining the path. She stared at it for a long time. "You did this," she whispered. "Yes," I said simply. She wanted to say more. I could feel it. But sometimes silence speaks louder than confessions. She put a hand on the flagpole like she needed to touch something real, something stronger than both of us. Then she turned and left without asking for forgiveness. I didn't offer it. What she gave me that night wasn't closure. It was acknowledgement, and that was enough. The Institute grew quickly. Veterans started calling it the Flame. We hosted leadership intensives, trauma recovery sessions, strategic wargaming exercises that looked more like quiet revolutions than drills. The people who came here didn't want to be saved. They wanted to be sharpened. I gave them the tools, not the applause. Every night before locking my office, I walked to the flagpole alone. It became a ritual. I'd tilt my head back, look at the stars through the fabric, and remind myself why this place existed. Not for Carl, not for Ethan, not for the Pentagon, for that 18-year-old girl who had no one. For the soldier in the mud who dragged her brothers out of gunfire. For the woman who stood in front of the world and ripped the false legacy away from the people who tried to steal it. On the anniversary of the Institute's opening, a group of recruits raised a plaque near the gate. I hadn't asked for it. I wouldn't have. But they did it anyway. It read, "For those who stood alone and became unbreakable." I stood there a long time after they left, tracing the letters with my fingertips, feeling the cold metal bite into my skin. It wasn't a medal. It was better. It was real. Sometimes reporters still try to call Carl. He doesn't answer anymore. Ethan faded into the background after his political career evaporated. Their names stopped appearing in headlines. Mine didn't, but not because I chased the spotlight, because the work spoke for itself. On the last night of the year, after the recruits had gone to sleep and the grounds were quiet, I stood by the flagpole alone. The wind was sharp, carrying the faint smell of rain and earth. The stars burned cold above Missouri, the kind of cold that makes everything feel sharper, clearer. I looked at the flag and thought of every version of myself that had stood beneath some sky like this, scared, humiliated, determined, relentless. I whispered, I never needed their love. I needed my own strength. And for the first time in my life, it felt like that strength had built something that would outlast me. Iron Flame wasn't a call sign anymore. It was a legacy, a real one, built alone, unstealable, untouchable, and finally mine. Some of us don't get justice from apologies. We build it ourselves. We build it with discipline when no one is watching, with grit when no one believes, and with silence when the world is too loud to hear the truth. This story wasn't about revenge for me. It was about reclaiming the ground beneath my feet, the same ground they once tried to wash away. The bucket of mop water they poured on me at 18 didn't end me. It built the spine I'd later use to stand in front of generals, senators, and a country watching live on national television. I didn't need their love. I needed my own strength. And once I learned that, everything changed. I carried every insult like a brick and turned it into a wall they could never climb. I carried every doubt like a map that led me exactly where I needed to go. People like Carl always believe they can rewrite the story when the ending turns out golden. But the truth is not theirs to steal. They laughed on a porch. I stood on a stage they could only watch through a screen. I didn't build Iron Flame for applause. I built it so that no other young recruit would ever have to fight their way out of the kind of silence I grew up in. I built it so they'd know strength doesn't need permission. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop needing closure from people who broke you. When you stop waiting for an apology that can't undo the past. When you realize their voices no longer shape your identity. That peace isn't loud, it's quiet. It's standing at the edge of your own legacy, watching a flag rise in the morning wind, knowing that everything standing behind you is real. That's where my story ends, not with Carl, not with a courtroom, not with tears, but with a field in Missouri, an academy full of warriors who've walked through their own darkness, and a sky wide enough to hold everything we've survived. If you're watching this, maybe you've been there too. Maybe someone underestimated you, humiliated you, told you that you weren't enough. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they walked away. Maybe they tried to steal your story when it turned into something they couldn't control. What would you have done if someone humiliated you at 18? Would you have broken or built? Where are you watching from? Drop your city and time below. And if Ember's story meant something to you, hit subscribe, share it with someone who once felt invisible, and remind them that silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. And one day it becomes power.